to call it a peace plan is probably a misnomer. It's really basically a repackaging of Russia's demands that they have had since the start of the war.
You know, corruption in Ukraine is a major problem. We wrestled with this problem day in, day out during the course of our administration.
We are seeing, in living color, out of the mouths of Trump administration officials, a raising of a red flag that says, hey, we're in trouble on the cyber front because we've sent all our people to work on the immigration front.
So what we're talking about basically is I think, the largest overhaul of the national security bureaucracy that we have had since 9/11. From the Vox Media Podcast Network, this is The Long Game. I'm John Feiner.
And I'm Jake Sullivan. John, where are you coming to us from today?
Well, I happen to be in Singapore, and it's a strange feeling. I can see just behind you, looking out your window, what looks like the New England countryside, is where I grew up, and I'm a long way from home.
You're right. I'm in Concord, New Hampshire, a place you know well, since you are the product of Hanover High School and New Hampshire sports, and this was the site of some of your great youthful glories, right? Concord.
Big wins, big losses, big rivalry, and happy that you've moved to New England. Finally seen the light and adopted a worthwhile part of the country to be hanging out.
So when I look out my window right now, I see stick season. The leaves are off the trees, but the snow hasn't fallen yet. So shout out to Noah Kahn. I now have a good sense of what stick season is, although I think he was talking about Vermont, not New Hampshire, but close enough.
Possible that he's the most famous graduate of my high school. And that's not a bad one to have, actually.
Nice. Well, we now have 2 episodes under our belt. This is episode 3. What's on the agenda?
We'll have an opportunity to do something we don't always get to do, which is check our own homework. Last week, we previewed a bit Mohammed bin Salman's visit to Washington, which took place this week. So we'll check in on how we did in setting that up and how the president and Mohammed bin Salman did in actually conducting that meeting and what came out of it. We'll also talk a little bit about what could be a pretty consequential week, I think, in the Russia-Ukraine war, where you have a confluence of a couple of things, an emerging corruption scandal in Ukraine, and then an effort by the Trump administration to launch another attempt to make peace between the two parties.
And then we're going to do a tabletop exercise that kind of serves as a snapshot of how the national security apparatus of the United States is dealing with the fact that the Trump administration has basically moved a huge amount of it to work on immigration enforcement, immigration roundups, rather than what their core jobs were in law enforcement or cybersecurity or what have you.
Ready to dive in?
Let's do it. I'll jump in on the first topic here, which is MBS's visit, which, as you said, we previewed last week. And, I guess what I would start by saying is just to talk about the imagery there in the Oval Office. If you had shown me a photo 5-10 years ago of the president and the, putative leader of Saudi Arabia standing in front of this golden-adorned backdrop, I would have said they were in Riyadh, not in Washington, D.C.
We have an extremely respected man in the Oval Office today, and a friend of mine for a long time, a very good friend of mine. And I'm very proud of the job he's done. What he's done is incredible in terms of human rights and everything else.
But somehow, President Trump has turned the Oval Office into quite the shiny place. It looks almost unrecognizable from when we were there just a year ago. And they stood there right in front of the press, and President Trump held forth about how much he loves MBS, how much he loves Saudi Arabia. And then there was this quite striking moment where a reporter asked about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. President Trump jumped in and basically said, things happen. And then went on to kind of berate the reporter. What do you make of just before we get into the substance and kind of a little bit grade our homework of how we set this up in the preview, John, what do you make of just this spectacle in the Oval, the complexity of this relationship, the personal dealings between these two guys? How'd you think this went? What was your reaction when you watched all this go down?
Yeah, I guess a couple things. One is, in addition to the new adornments that the president has made to the Oval Office, there's another big difference about how they kind of conduct their business when they have foreign visitors, which is the traditional appearance in front of the press in the Oval Office is a pretty scripted, pretty rote, pretty simplistic affair where one side, the hosts, the president, welcomes the other, says how happy he is to have the visitor there. The visitor expresses gratitude for being hosted, and they kind of get on with their lives. Maybe there's a word or two about policy. President Trump does this in a very different way. These appearances in front of the cameras in the Oval Office before the meeting has even taken place can last an hour. I think this one was about 45 minutes. And often the biggest news of these visits comes out of this somewhat impromptu back and forth with the press. And that was the case for this meeting. As you said, there was this pretty heated exchange where, by the way, the president didn't just say things happen. He actually sort of blamed the victim.
You're mentioning somebody that was extremely controversial. A lot of people didn't like that gentleman that you're talking about. Whether you like him or didn't like him, things happen. But he knew nothing about it, and we can leave it at that. You don't have to embarrass our guest by asking a question like that.
Quite something.
Striking, and I think, just pretty appalling in a lot of ways. But this relationship, as you said, is a super complicated one. We wrestled with it during the course of our administration. I think ultimately got to a place where we could work constructively with Saudi Arabia, having taken some actions against them in the wake of this killing. President Trump, as we said last week, has just had a fundamentally different approach, never really acknowledging that there was any wrongdoing on the part of the Saudis, let alone on the part of MBS. And in this case, going one step further and actually saying, the guy kind of had it coming, which is a wild statement from the President of the United States.
Just to spend one more minute on, what it's like preparing for these Oval Office meetings, press coming in, the president, the guests making comments, press going out. So that's always been the tradition. It was the tradition through multiple administrations, and that's how President Biden approached it as well. This kind of freewheeling circus that Trump does, it's got to be especially hard for authoritarian leaders who are not actually used to facing the press. I remember in our administration when Prime Minister Modi came, who's not an authoritarian, technically is a democratically elected leader, but with some authoritarian tendencies, that he had not taken a question from the press in a press conference in several years. And we had to have an extensive negotiation because after that, the back and forth in the Oval, there was going to be a formal press conference. And it's hard to have a formal press conference if one of the two people in the press conference won't answer questions. So we finally got the Indian delegation to agree that Prime Minister Modi would take a question from an American reporter, a tough question. But that took weeks of negotiating and was, as I mentioned, the first time he'd done it in a very long time. And then I also remember when we were in Bali with Xi Jinping in the summit between President Biden and President Xi, a reporter tried to shout. That was one where each side just said their 30 seconds. But at the end of it, a reporter tried to shout a question about human rights and actually got physically pulled back by a Chinese security person or a delegation member. So the Chinese were like just ready for the U.S. press to jump in and we're going to shut it down. And there was reporting about that in the days that followed. But just being inside MBS's head, I'll bet he walked into that room thinking, oh man, what the heck's going to go on here? And if you look at him during this period while President Trump is answering about Khashoggi, he's just kind of looking down at his hands, kind of hoping the whole thing is going to be over. So, worth spending a minute on just on the one hand, the terrible nature of the answer President Trump gave. On the other hand, the kind of interesting, frankly, kind of American idea that, we bring these foreign authoritarians in and the press gets to stand there and kind of shout questions at them. It is definitely 101, sort of First Amendment 101. So something to keep watching as we go forward and other potential authoritarians or dictators come marching through the United States. But the other thing I just wanted to say at the outset goes to this issue of how complex this relationship is. And you mentioned that for President Trump, it's pretty simple. He just kind of wishes away or ignores or maybe even admires, who knows, what's happened with respect to the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. For President Biden, it was, extremely difficult. He really wrestled with this. And he took a lot of grief for going to Saudi Arabia, took a lot of grief for this fist bump. I was actually riding in the Beast, the presidential limo with him up to where he met with MBS. And I had no idea when he got out what he was going to do. Shake hands, fist bump, something else. So I actually didn't realize what exactly had happened until we left the meeting and saw the coverage. But I think what President Biden saw was that you can hold two ideas in your head at the same time. On the one hand, this was a terrible crime that cannot be ignored and should never be repeated. But also, while we have to continue to recognize and look at that chapter, we also have to try to write a new chapter with Saudi Arabia because it's in the interest of the United States and of the region and of the world to do so. And he was trying to balance all of that and balance the three-dimensional nature of this young leader in trying to chart a path forward, which was never easy and, subject him and us to a lot of criticism, but I think ultimately was the right way to approach the relationship.
We laid out a few things that we thought might happen when MBS came to the Oval Office, came to Washington. I think we said, some sort of announcement related to technology cooperation, some sort of security arrangement, maybe even a big security guarantee or some sort of deal, maybe something on the Saudi-Israel relationship, certainly not full normalization. And I think we were both pretty skeptical that there would be anything too substantial there. How do you think we did overall based on what actually happened?
I'd give us a B. We said that MBS his overriding, his most important priority was to get the chips, and he got them. He got an announcement of tens of thousands of chips. We don't really have the fine print on what exactly the restrictions are around those to ensure that they can't be exploited in some way by China. But he did get the chips, and for him, I think he goes home thinking he achieved what he wanted. He did get a set of security and defense agreements. He got major non-NATO ally status, which is not all that substantive, but sends a signal of an upgrade in the defense relationship. He got a defense cooperation agreement that's really more nuts and bolts. But he didn't get a full security guarantee, and we debated whether that would come. That did not come. He got a bunch of F-35s, and I think he will be very happy with that. And so from his perspective, I think he walks out validated by the President of the United States, embraced on the biggest stage, with the chips, with the planes, with some defense agreements. So that all feels pretty good to him. I think on the U.S. side, it's a little less clear what we got out of it. He had previously committed to $600 billion in investment in the United States. On this trip, he raised that to $1 trillion. Great. The 600 billion wasn't real. The trillion isn't really real.
I think pretty soon these guys are going to start to say gazillion or something.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I mean, the entire Saudi GDP in a year is, not that far north of $1 trillion. So it's all a bit funny money. So I think we did okay. One thing we didn't talk about that I think we should talk about for a minute here, and that you and I discussed right after we got off the podcast and said, oh, we should have mentioned that, is Sudan. Because I know MBS went into this, thinking we have to make progress to end this terrible, god-awful war and humanitarian catastrophe in Sudan. And he made that pitch to the president. The president actually came out yesterday and said, hey, I want to work on this. I don't know if that'll happen, but that would be a good thing. And that is something that actually could be a quite positive result of this summit if we see follow through.
Yeah, I had the same reaction. I thought it was interesting that it wasn't really sort of formally part of the presentation of the meetings. And then the president, as is often the case, decided to sort of muse about it in front of the cameras somewhat separately. And I agree with you. Look, if the president and the administration became seized with trying to end the conflict in Sudan, which is by far the worst humanitarian crisis, worst conflict currently going on the planet. That would be a good thing. And the fact that it's now on his radar, which to be honest, I'm not sure it was before this, I think is also a good thing. And so I would give the Saudis credit for introducing that into the relationship and into the meeting. This is a conflict we wrestled with as well. This is often the case in wars, but there really are no heroes on either side of this one. Two truly sort of villainous generals, one named Burhan, who leads the Sudanese armed forces, the other named Hamedi, who leads a paramilitary force, and they have been fighting for years now, both having committed horrific atrocities. We had a finding about Hamedi having committed genocide. He's essentially the descendant of the leaders of the Janjaweed, who had been accused previously and now charged in the International Criminal Court of having committed genocide in Darfur 20 years earlier. So not exactly a positive figure there. And then Burhan himself, who maybe has a slightly more official role in the Sudanese government, or did before this conflict, there have been credible reports that he's committed atrocities against civilians, maybe even using chemical weapons. So this is a mess, and I think the United States could productively and profitably introduce, I think, some pressure to try to end it. It's going to involve, by the way, pressure on the people who are backing these two leaders. The Saudis have certainly been more supportive of the SAF and Burhan, alongside other countries that the United States maintains good relationships with, like Egypt. On the other side of the conflict, Saudi Arabia's near neighbor, the UAE, has been involved. Look, it's going to take diplomacy. It's going to take, I think, leadership from the president and his level to try to end this, but it would be a good thing.
It would be a good thing. And it was a good thing that, President Trump acknowledged that MBS actually came and raised this and said, hey, let's try to do something on this. For me, it's interesting. It's kind of a reminder that MBS is a complicated character, a really three-dimensional character. So you've got the Khashoggi murder, and you can't look away from that, as we've discussed. But you've also got a guy here who's trying to modernize his country, dramatically expand the role of women in the workforce, dramatically reduce the role of the religious police. 25 years ago, most of the hijackers on 9/11 were Saudi. And a lot of the financing going to terrorists globally was coming out of the Gulf and out of Saudi. MBS has tried to take his country past all that. And then he went from, prosecuting a very vicious war in Yemen to a ceasefire there, and now to being a real champion of de-escalation and efforts at peace. Positive actor in this Gaza ceasefire, trying to be a positive actor, it seems, in making some progress in Sudan, despite the fact that he's, played a role in it, or his country has, over the last few years. So I think, I was sorry to see, not surprised, but sorry to see President Trump just be so dismissive on the Khashoggi thing. I think there is an honest conversation to be had with the American people about investing in the future of Saudi Arabia, building a relationship with this crown prince who's likely to be governing for a very long time, trying to do constructive things that serve the American people, but also not being shy about speaking out on issues related to human rights and to terrible crimes like the crime committed against Jamal Khashoggi. And I think that was an opportunity missed here. But, this relationship is going to be with us for a long time, and we're going to have to think about how we grapple with it in all its dimensions, not just the cartoon character that some people see with MBS.
Yeah, totally agree. By the way, the other place where MBS has had a bit of an evolution towards de-escalation is on Iran. He got asked about that during the visit as well, and talked about how he is now, supportive of direct conversations between the United States and Iran to try to de-escalate that situation. That is not something he would have said in the, not so distant past when asked a similar question.
Hey, one more thing here, John, that we didn't talk about, that we did kind of tee up in the podcast last week in the preview: normalization with Israel. Obviously that didn't move forward here, and you and I kind of thought it was unlikely to. But where do you see all that going?
I guess neither of us expected this, in part because the Saudis have been pretty clear privately and publicly that absent pretty definitive statements from the United States, from the government of Israel, that a major effort towards a Palestinian state is on the table, they weren't going to go in the direction of normalization. We obviously haven't gotten that. Certainly from the Israeli government, probably won't get that, almost certainly won't get that from this Israeli government until and unless there's an election that shakes things up. And so I think normalization is probably on the back burner for a while. And, I've been wondering also, why wasn't there more of an announcement on a U.S. security guarantee the way we suspected there might be? It's possible that these things are related. MBS has wanted a particular form of a security guarantee, not exactly what the United States did for Qatar, which is essentially a rhetorical commitment from one administration to Qatar that could be abandoned by the next one. What he wants is a Senate-ratified treaty that has the kind of full weight, full imprimatur of the United States government that I think he believes will be more enduring. And I think the only way he could get that through the United States Senate is in the context of normalization with Israel. At least that's been his belief. I think that was probably our belief when we were there. And so if one is not in the offing, the other probably wasn't either. And so I think he basically just said, let's hold off on a lesser form of security guarantee for now.
Yeah. So to the question of what people should be watching for coming out of this visit, looking out over the horizon, you've got this question of normalization and the security guarantee, which do seem to be linked. You have how this AI build out will actually happen in Saudi with these chips that have been promised. And, will the security parameters be in place to ensure that that happens in a way that's consistent with our interests? Your point, President Trump kind of seemed to make an offhand comment that there could be some talks with Iran. Could there be a way forward on diplomacy with Iran that involves the Gulf states? Can they take this Sudan issue forward? That would be big if they could. And then, just one last marker to put down that we should come back to in future episodes. We haven't talked about the fact that Saudi's financial situation is pretty bad. They balance their budget with oil between $90 and $100 a barrel. Right now, it's $63 a barrel. So is Saudi actually going to have the capital both to do what it wants to do at home, but also to continue to invest abroad, including the gazillions that it's promised to the U.S.? Just a flag for the future that I think we will have to return to ask, Saudis used to be, has used to have been being a bottomless pit of cash and may not be going forward. And for our listeners and viewers, stay tuned on that.
Right. Don't try to cash the game show size $1 trillion check this week. And give it a bit of time.
Exactly.
All right. Should we move on to Russia, Ukraine?
Yep.
All right. So on this one, this conflict sometimes feels, to me at least, like it generates a lot of news, certainly a lot of pain and suffering on both sides of the conflict, but that day in, day out, very little actually changes the fundamentals, the sort of strategic picture. I think I've said at least once on one of these shows that if you gave me at least a daily report and didn't have the date at the top of it about what had happened on the battlefield, I would have a hard time placing that on a timeline of really the last 3 years because there has been so much consistency, so much sort of stasis. But it does feel like to me that this week could be one that we look back on as a possible inflection point because of the kind of intersection of two emerging trends. One is this corruption scandal that has erupted inside the Ukrainian government, right now focused predominantly on the energy sector. At least the reports from an independent anti-corruption body in Ukraine that as much as $100 million has been stolen, has been embezzled. But it also seems as if that is not the end of the story and that the corruption scandal could grow. There have already been some significant senior people fired inside the Ukrainian government and calls for more to be dismissed. And then simultaneous to that, maybe related, maybe not, the Trump administration is making another push at some sort of peace plan. And there have been a range of reports about what this peace plan is going to entail, all of which seem like they are far more favorable to Russia than I think certainly you and I think would be appropriate and just. And Ukraine, having been weakened, and Zelensky himself having been weakened by this corruption scandal and being on his back foot, is now under tremendous pressure from the Trump administration, possibly to take a deal that I think he very much thinks is an unfair one for him. So, it's possible that this is a turning point. It's possible that it's not. Wondering how you see all this playing out, given these two new developments.
Well, it's funny that, we have ourselves done this optimistic case versus pessimistic case. We talked about how, while we thought it was likely the war would go on, and we both had conviction on that, we also said we wouldn't be bowled over if there was some series of concessions Trump made to Putin, and then Putin would take a ceasefire. And this peace plan definitely looks like a series of concessions to Putin. And, you mentioned two issues at the top, this new peace proposal that's been reported, and this really quite dramatic corruption scandal in Kyiv. And it does feel like the two of them are connected, that somehow the president, Steve Witkoff, others in the administration see some opportunity, because Zelensky's on his back foot, to try to push him to swallow things he hasn't previously swallowed. Do you think that's a fair read of the situation? Do you think that part of why this is all happening right now is because of the corruption scandal, or am I seeing connections where they don't exist?
Look, hard to know, but the president has demonstrated a kind of an eye for weakness when he smells it among people he considers on some level his adversaries. And I don't want to say that he believes Ukraine is his adversary or President Zelensky is his adversary, but he certainly has not treated him like a friend during the course of this administration. And so I think he does sense, and by the way, he's wanted to end this war from the beginning. I think that instinct is not inherently wrong, but my view, I think our view has always been it's important how the war ends. And so they have put together, again, according to reports, they haven't said this publicly, a 28-point peace plan that has some pretty wild things in it. It has Ukraine giving up the remainder of the territory of the Donbass. I think it's about 14% of the Donbass that Ukraine still holds. Russia is occupying the rest of it. So without Russia having to win that on the battlefield, Ukraine would cede that territory to Russia. But it goes well beyond that, too. I think everybody has anticipated there would have to be some negotiation about territory in the course of trying to end this conflict. But the other side of the ledger is, what does Ukraine get in terms of its future security? If it is going to part with some percentage of its territory that Russia has essentially stolen through warfare, what does Ukraine get in terms of guarantees that 6 months from now, 6 years from now, Russia won't just come back and try to take more? And this plan does not have a lot to satisfy, I think, Ukraine's desire for that security. In fact, it asks, at least again, according to reports, that Ukraine shrinks the size of its army, that it commit not to allow foreign forces on its soil, that it give up any claim to certain weapon systems, long-range weapon systems that could fire into Russia. So, this is going to be a hard pill for Zelensky to swallow, one I don't think that he frankly should, but one that he may feel less able to resist, again, given the other factors that we've been describing, than he would have under normal circumstances. Doesn't mean he will, but he is between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, so kind of the way I read the situation is, like you said, I think the Trump administration smells some weakness and thinks they can push Zelensky. On the Russian side, we are now a day or two, maybe a day away from those oil sanctions that the Trump administration announced actually going into effect on the two largest Russian oil companies. So the Russians had an interest in having their negotiator fly over to the U.S. and sit down with Witkoff and put some quote unquote proposal on the table, because I think they'd like to either push off those sanctions, or even if they go into effect, not really have them enforced in a way that will hit Russia's economy hard. So this guy, Kirill Dmitriev, the Russian envoy, who also, by the way, is the head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund, goes and meets with Witkoff. They come out with this plan. And I think to call it a peace plan is probably a misnomer. It's really basically a repackaging of Russia's demands that they have had since the start of the war, including the things you said on territory, on neutering the Ukrainian military, on blocking any kind of real meaningful security guarantee from the West. And they pull that together. And then they start giving these pretty brash background quotes to U.S. press, basically saying, this is a fait accompli. We're gonna push Zelensky to take it. We don't care what the Europeans say. We're just gonna make Zelensky take it. That was yesterday. Today, as we tape this on a Thursday, Rubio's backpedaling a bit. It's really hard to say how this exactly will play out, but I think here's what we know for sure. One, the terms of this plan are kind of ridiculous. I mean, they're basically the Russian imposition of its will on Ukraine. Two, the Ukrainians are going to have a very hard time swallowing this, and Zelensky, even in under pressure as he is, I think is going to have a hard time turning around to his people and saying that this is a reasonable thing to do. But then three, Zelensky is still going to have to answer for what is a real scandal, which is this quite detailed reporting from the Ukrainian anti-corruption authorities, as you just laid out at the top, John, about basically the siphoning off of funds that were meant to go to pay for protecting energy from strikes by Russia so that Ukrainians could stay warm and keep the lights on in the winter. I mean, that is if true, and there's a lot of evidence mounting, that is a shocking thing. And I think Zelensky really has to take decisive action to do something about it. And it's not yet clear exactly what he will do, but the intersection of these two things, this new plan getting put forward and the pressure put on him diplomatically by the U.S., and then the pressure rising up from below because of the vividness and outrageousness of this corruption scandal. Man, Zelensky's in quite, I think, what you'd call the proverbial hot seat right now.
In the interest of just being candid about the situation, corruption in Ukraine is a major problem. We wrestled with this problem day in, day out during the course of our administration.
Yeah, we can't be shocked that there's gambling in the casino. I think it's fair to say.
Exactly. And, and as much as we, I think, want to defend Zelensky's position when it comes to waging the war, it is also a fact that his office tried to, as recently as July of this year, limit some of the powers of the exact anti-corruption institutions that have now come out with this reporting. That law that they tried to pass had to get repealed when it got criticized. There were protests in the streets of Kyiv for the first time, really, since the outbreak of the war over Zelensky's attempts to weaken the anti-corruption bodies. And now, to some extent, he is reaping what he sowed, because they have produced a report that I think most Ukrainians consider to be credible. And so a lot of this is going to come down to how effectively he can get his arms around this situation. I think starting with something he's already done, which is acknowledging the seriousness of this, holding people accountable. But the question is, how much does it grow from here? Right now, it's the energy sector, which is a truly offensive thing, I think, to a lot of Ukrainians, because they're about to head into a winter where they're expecting there are going to be brownouts. They're going to lose heat during very cold months. And they are learning now that, $100 million has been taken out of the effort to try to provide them with those basic things. If this moves into the defense sector, which the European countries, the United States have put tens of billions of dollars into, I worry, among all the other things that we've been discussing, is that it's going to fuel and give arguments to people who already, for a range of other reasons, are ready to get off the Ukraine bandwagon, ready to stop supporting them in this war. It's going to enable them to claim, well, a lot of this money that we've been providing, which they don't really want to provide anyway, is being squandered. And so there is a lot of negativity that could flow from this if they don't get their arms around it and get under control. And so I think, even as he tries to fend off the Trump administration's effort to get him to take this bad deal, I think job one for Zelensky has got to be cauterizing the wound here and getting his political standing in Ukraine solidified. It's not going to be easy for him to do that.
John, as you say, corruption's been a reality in Ukraine for a long time. And it points up a real challenge for U.S. policymakers and European policymakers. So let's say for the moment, you and I were still sitting in our seats in the NSC suite in the West Wing, and we were briefed on this. Basically, money's getting siphoned off, money that the United States and others are putting in to build the defenses for the energy grid. Okay, you got two choices. One is you keep giving the money because you need the defenses for the energy grid. The other is you say, okay, well, since stuff's getting siphoned off, we're cutting it off. But then Ukraine doesn't have the money to be able to protect the energy grid, to keep the lights on and keep the heat on. So can you just talk for a minute about how you would and did grapple with that tension sitting in the seat, that you've got a country you want to support, but a country with a history of corruption? And these are hard calls.
Yeah, I mean, I think a way to handle this would be to try to see some opportunity in crisis for the Ukrainians. And the opportunity here might be, there have been a number of demands for reforms that the United States has been calling for years. Some of them the Ukrainians have made, some of them, frankly, they have just sort of flatly ignored. This would be a moment, I think, to go to the Ukrainians, by the way, with an eye towards helping improve and solidify their position. There is no desire on the part of the United States, at least our administration, to hurt the Ukrainians, but to help them improve their position, improve their standing with their own people, lay out a series of steps, and make, to some extent, our continued support for them, not necessarily quid pro quo conditional, but say that we are going to have to think very hard about our ongoing support. And it's going to be hard for us to justify going to our Congress and asking for more money if you don't take, with a high degree of specificity, the following 10, 15, 28, whatever it is, steps, and push them to work through those. And I suspect that there's a version of that conversation happening, but it seems like a lower priority for this administration than jamming through the end of the war.
Yeah. I think this, let's watch this space closely, because this is a significant political crisis in Kyiv. I think how Zelensky handles it will be a huge test for him, one of the biggest tests since the tanks rolled across the Ukrainian frontier back in 2022. And let's hope that he actually takes the kinds of steps that you just described to make real reforms. And let's also hope that the Trump administration backs off from just trying to shove down Ukraine's throat what is a Russian peace plan. And by the way, you should have your doubts about whether a plan is a good plan if the Russian guy who negotiated comes out crowing that finally Russia feels its position is, quote, really being heard. I would not call that a good sign from Ukraine's perspective. So we'll see how all this plays out.
That quote that you just referred to from Dmitriev almost made me feel better, because it made me feel like maybe Russia was trying to tank the whole thing by sort of revealing the game, that this was
spiking the football.
So slanted in their interest. Unfortunately, I don't think that's the case. And just to underscore the weirdness of this, the Ukrainian who has been sort of most tied to these negotiations, they've largely been done, as you said, between the Russians and the United States. But there has been one Ukrainian named Umerov who has a version of the job, Jake, that you had for President Biden, for President Zelensky, who has at least been engaged with the United States on this. He is also one of the figures rumored to be involved in the corruption scandal too. So the complexity of this is just a lot, I think, for the traffic to bear in Ukraine. So we'll see how it plays out.
Umerov, as I understand it, the Trump administration has kind of put out that they briefed him to a certain extent on the terms of this. But I think his understanding of what the terms are quite different from what is being read out in the press here in the United States. So a lot to still figure out in the days ahead. One scenario I'm looking for that sits at the intersection of the corruption scandal and this effort to force a ceasefire, pretty much against Ukraine's will, is whether or not the U.S. will start demanding new elections in Ukraine, basically put some political pressure on Zelensky and give a win to Putin, who's obviously wanted to see Zelensky gone. So hard to say whether that will be a feature here in the coming days, but I would put that squarely in the what to watch out for category.
We'll be discussing this again soon. I'm confident.
All right, let's move on to the home front. Does that make sense, John?
Home front and maybe the near abroad, but yeah, the home front.
Okay, so I'm going to set this up, and we're going to do a little bit of an informal tabletop where we try to work through what the implications are of this massive shift in energy, resources, and personnel to immigration. So at the beginning of his term, President Trump directed the Department of Homeland Security to, as he put it in an executive order, take all appropriate action to supplement available personnel to secure the southern border and enforce the immigration laws of the United States. But there just were not enough ICE agents to meet President Trump's demand. So the decision was taken at the highest levels. Let's look around the entire U.S. Homeland Security and national security enterprise and just start collecting people and throw them at this problem. So, John, you were the principal deputy national security advisor when a major priority from the president was set down. You'd have to go actually work through what the implications of that were, game out what it would mean to actually take thousands of people off of their beats and put them on the immigration beat. So let's imagine for the moment you're sitting in the Situation Room. You've got the deputies from the Department of Justice, the Treasury Department, the State Department, and other parts of the U.S. government, and you're trying to figure out, okay, look, we're going to do this. We're going to take all these people and make them part of our immigration enforcement apparatus, and they won't be doing what they normally do.
Yeah. So what we're talking about basically is I think the largest overhaul of the national security bureaucracy that we have had since 9/11, when we sort of reoriented almost all of the departments and agencies that work on foreign policy and national security toward the problem of terrorism. And so, you'd have people around the table and you would say some version of the president has laid out his highest priority in terms of the security of the United States. And it is the sort of related threat of drug cartels and migration. And everybody is going to need to put some skin in the game. And that is going to mean putting personnel against this task. People who currently are working on other priorities, even if you consider them higher priorities, are going to have to be repurposed to work on what the president has just laid out. By the way, this is a version, I think, of what the Bush administration did in the aftermath of 9/11, with the big difference that that time there was the precursor of a giant terrorist attack against the United States. Here, this administration has just decided, actually, that there was this threat that, by the way, was not unrecognized by us and by other prior administrations, but that was just not given sufficient weight and priority, and it has now become this overriding concern. So you'd probably ask people, who do you have that you can put against this, and what missions that they were previously performing are we going to move down the list of priorities? And you would ask people to come back with a plan for implementing this presidential priority.
What have we seen as a result of that? So imagine, based on what's actually unfolded over the last 2 years, how does that conversation go in the Oval? The Deputy Attorney General says to you, okay, I'm diverting thousands of DOJ agents from across the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, the U.S. Marshals. And you'd say, okay, well, what's that going to mean? Well, what has it meant?
Well, 6,700 federal employees who were not previously focused on this task have now been told that this is your job. I think it's about a quarter of FBI agents, 3,000 diverted from more traditional national security work to do this. And, similar numbers across the rest of the federal apparatus. So, anecdotally, I think we've all talked to people who we worked with or we knew who are still in the government, described basically getting word from the White House that maybe one day your mission was to track terrorists from Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Al-Shabaab or any one of a number of organizations that are still plotting, by the way, against the United States. Even if that threat has been reduced by 20 years of counterterrorism pressure, some of the best people at finding targets, at tracking people of interest. And now those people have been diverted to focusing on cartel leaders who are, again, according to this administration, now the biggest threat they face. And so, people who were looking at the Middle East and looking at South Asia and looking at East Africa are now looking at our southern border and the countries just on the other side of it and applying the same tools and tactics that they learned in working on terrorism predominantly to this very different problem. And so it does raise the question of what is going to be left on the cutting room floor or what is going to be deprioritized as we make this shift, and what are the costs of that?
And we see already the costs of that, the real world playing out of a different set of priorities. Money laundering prosecutions down, weapons prosecutions down. Those agents who were assigned to online child predators, to child sexual exploitation, to child pornography, reassigned. And the administration actually is sensitive to this. We've seen reports of the administration actually telling FBI agents to avoid leaving a paper trail, that they've been reassigned from these kinds of sensitive areas where we're seeing a real material reduction in focus and prosecution to this. So you can tell the administration knows that something is not right here. And by the way, this is not just DOJ. You might want to talk for a minute about the issue of Iranian oil sanctions, but let me focus on another area, which is cybersecurity. The Department of Homeland Security has been sending relocation orders to some of our top cybersecurity experts to go to ICE, to go to CBP, to go to the Federal Protective Service, which guards immigration centers. And they've told them, if you refuse a relocation, it's going to lead to termination. So more than a third cut from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. And crazily enough, just in the last week, CISA has put out a call saying, hey, we have huge vacancies. We need to hire up. We're being harmed because there's a 40% vacancy rate across key mission areas. Well, that's hardly surprising given that you created the 40% vacancy rate by sending all these people to work on immigration enforcement. But we are seeing in living color out of the mouths of Trump administration officials a cry, a raising of a red flag that says, hey, we're in trouble on the cyber front because we've sent all our people to work on the immigration front. So as you kind of work through the theory of prepping for this, if we had done a tabletop on this, you would have this is obvious, it was predictable. Indeed, it was predicted back at the start that if you move all these people out of these areas, you're going to end up with huge gaps and leave the United States vulnerable.
Yeah, not ideal, by the way, that this is also happening simultaneous, or was happening simultaneous to the efforts of DOJ to dramatically decrease the size of the overall federal apparatus, including the national security apparatus. So, while again, after 9/11, there were a bunch of mistakes made. I'm not trying to say that everything that was done after 9/11 was ideal. Far from it. I feel quite strongly the opposite. But one of the things that the Bush administration did do was significantly increase the size of the national security apparatus because they believed we had bigger problems than they realized when they first came to office. So here you have the Trump people saying, actually, we do have this enormous problem. We got to take a lot of personnel and send them towards it, but we also have to decrease the overall size of everything at the same time. So as you say, this is going to create all kinds of vacancies. You gave some good examples. Another one, which you mentioned, is the enforcement of sanctions against Iran. So we're in this situation where the administration says its policy is to try to pressure Iran to come to the table to make a deal on its nuclear program after having taken military action. That's still the goal. That's still what's required to have a long-term solution to the Iranian nuclear problem. But just last month in October, according to data that's now been published, Iran exported, estimate is about 2.2 million barrels of crude oil per day, which is the highest level of Iranian exports since 2018. By the way, in 2018, Trump was president and the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, was still in place at that time. So we're now where under which Iran was basically allowed to export a significant volume of oil. They no longer are, according to our sanctions, but the numbers have crept back up even to that Iran nuclear deal level. And I think part of that story has got to be that people who would otherwise be working on enforcing these sanctions have now been shifted to other priorities.
Yeah. I mean, the answer to the question, what does Iranian oil sanctions enforcement have to do with immigration enforcement, turns out to be everything. If you take the people working on enforcing our Iran sanctions and you reassign them to immigration duties, it's not a bit of a surprise that this is the results you're going to get. And one of the things, John, that we're watching now happen as a result, which is another knock-on effect that I think could be anticipated, gaming this out from the beginning, is that a lot of people are just choosing to leave rather than deal with this. Folks we know who say, I signed up to the U.S. government to work on cyber or counterterrorism or sanctions enforcement. I didn't sign up to go be part of ICE. They're being told, do it or else. And so they're saying, I'll take or else, I'm going to leave. And so just as an example, the section of the Department of Justice that tracks foreign espionage in the United States has lost a third of its personnel. People just saying, I'm done, I'm out of here. So president gets to choose his priorities. This president has chosen his priorities. But I think it's our job to say, okay, but what are the knock-on effects of that? And in this case, the knock-on effects across all of these areas of national security are real. And as a result, the U.S. is definitely more vulnerable than it was before. And that's something that I'm not sure is getting briefed up to him in a real way. And that, as I mentioned before, the administration is trying to basically hide or paper over. But it's something that really requires us shining a spotlight on because these trade-offs are real.
All right. Should we do our wrap?
Yeah, kick us off.
All right. So just to describe it one more time, since this was a new feature that we added last week, this is a thing we'll keep coming back to that is a reference to a meeting that we used to have at the end of the day, at the end of every day, in Jake's office with our sort of core NSC team to talk about what had happened during that day and what's still to come. We're going to do 3 recurring features. The first of which is a recommendation of content that we've digested, either reading or some other form. Do you have a recommendation to start us off?
So Anthropic, the major artificial intelligence company, one of the leading AI companies in the world, recently put out a report on how China is actually taking Anthropic's model, Claude, which a lot of our viewers and listeners use, jailbreaking it, taking away the guardrails, and then using it to do cyber attacks against American critical infrastructure. The report itself is great, but if you just go online, there's actually just a very short summary of it, a few pages, that is vivid reading and points to a future where the potential for the use of AI for cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, man, it's not just a future, it's the present. So I think everybody should take a look at that. In one of our future episodes, we'll dig in on this issue, which I think, is ripe for a deeper dive. But that would be my recommendation to folks, especially those who, want to stay up at night a little bit.
So I've got one from Bloomberg Magazine from a couple weeks ago, and it goes to an issue that I've thought about a lot but didn't really know a lot about, which is the effort to bring nuclear power back to the United States. My kind of going in assumption on this question was that some combination of sort of excessive concern about the possibility of nuclear accidents based on things that happened a long time ago but actually haven't happened all that recently in an industry that's pretty safe, plus maybe some excessive regulation had slowed down what I think is a pretty essential part of U.S. energy mix, or should be, given that it's zero emissions. Bloomberg published an article called "The Risky Movement to Make America Nuclear Again," which had the rare effect, at least for me, of really kind of altering my thinking on this. And now I'm back to really totally unsure as to how safe and how secure and how smart it is to really push forward with a sector that the United States, I think, is making a big bet on. This administration.
Wait, really? So you're off nuclear power?
I'm not off nuclear. I think I'm probably still ultimately coming down in the pro camp, but this massively complicated my thinking. It's focused on a startup called Oklo, which has gotten a lot of attention and a significant amount of funding. It's working on these small modular reactors, and the war that company, companies like it, and the Trump administration is waging against the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to try to remove some of the barriers to getting these things going, and raises the specter of real concerns. So I think it's worth reading. I may not. I may still come down in the camp of really needing this. I think we probably desperately do as a country, but it's not as straightforward as it was before I read this article.
All right.
Any coming events, coming attractions that you want to preview for the group?
Yeah, so I think next week, one of the issues that we'll talk about is the increasing tensions between Japan and China. You've got the Japanese prime minister, the new prime minister, first female prime minister of Japan, taking a very tough line on China, China reacting with its own very tough line. You've got warships appearing around disputed islands. You've got escalation between the two biggest economies in Asia. So where's this all going? Is this going to come to a head, or are we going to see de-escalation? And we'll talk about that.
Good one, because it's issue number one, certainly out in this part of the world. I would just point to what could be something that evolves into quite a significant issue, or could be something that goes away. But the broad topic, I think, is quite important, one we'll come back to, which is that there has been the first outbreak of Marburg in the country of Ethiopia. And that outbreak has now led to a few deaths just in the past few days. Marburg is a hemorrhagic fever. It's a lot like Ebola, I think.
Except worse.
Because it's got the name of a German town that sounds sort of nondescript. People don't tend to focus on it as much as they do Ebola. There's no Michael Crichton novel about it. But as you just said, it's got a higher fatality rate than Ebola. And obviously is an issue of real concern. And as we've flagged previously, this outbreak comes at a time when the United States has dismantled a lot of the apparatus that we have to deal with diseases like this and to prevent them from coming to our soil. So this is not a warning that should keep people up at night that they're about to get infected with Marburg, but it is something that's worth watching. And whether it's this outbreak or another, I think we're going to come back to the topic of pandemics repeatedly during the course of this podcast. Anything you've gotten wrong, Jake, that you'd like to atone for, apologize for, acknowledge?
Maybe not atone or apologize, but I did think that the Trump administration would give Saudi Arabia what at Cape Cutter, this executive order that's kind of a partway to a security guarantee. So I was a bit surprised that there was really nothing in that. But the point you made earlier in the podcast about how I think they are linking it to normalization, and which probably makes sense in a way. That was a little bit of a surprise for me. I'm not shocked, but a little bit of a surprise for me. How about you?
I go a little further back in time, and then this is something you've actually written about, so I suspect you'll agree, which is coming into the Trump administration, if there was one relationship I would have thought would have been a close relationship, one that we considered a very important relationship, and that the Trump administration would want to build on, it was the U.S.-India relationship. For reasons I won't get into now, but that I'm sure we're going to come back to during the course of this podcast, that relationship has gone sort of wildly off the rails. I don't think it's irreparable, but I think there has been a lot of harm done to a relationship that may be, at the end of the day, the most important bilateral relationship with a partner that the United States has anywhere in the world, and it is not in a good place. And I would have expected, based on the Trump Prime Minister Modi sort of bromance that they had during Trump's first term, that this would have gone better.
There's a lot I want to do to sound off on this subject. I will restrain myself for today, but let's also stick that in the coming attractions category.
Excellent. All right.
Well, that's all for today. We'll be back with a new episode on December 5th. Wishing everyone a happy Thanksgiving.
We want to thank Vox for featuring our first 3 episodes on their channel.
Make sure to click the link below and subscribe to the Long Game's official YouTube channel to catch all future episodes.